Hi there, and welcome to a new episode of Impact Talks. Today we have Deputy Executive Director of Greenpeace USA, Chad Stein, with us. Chad, can you please tell us who you are and what you do?
Hi, Lava. Thanks for having me. Really excited to be here and have the conversation today. So Deputy Executive Greenpeace US, been there for about 7 years and had an opportunity to be in a lot of different roles over my times at the organization. Started out within the data team and came up to COO after that. Had an opportunity to actually step in and lead on the program side of our house a couple years ago and moved into Deputy Executive Director after that. Prior to that, I really started in healthcare. Grew up in a small college town in Virginia here, where health system is a big part of the economy, and started in the finance area there, and got into technology within that space, and then moved into consulting on that specific technology, a multi-dimensional reporting analytics platform, and moved from consulting to some time at Fannie Mae, which is part of our secondary mortgage market here in the U.S. And then from Fannie Mae, actually back to consulting with the same organization for a while, and then decided I want to do something a bit different and started looking at nonprofits, and that's when I kind of made the move into Greenpeace.
That's actually one of the questions I wanted to ask you because you had a past that wasn't charity related, and now you are in an NGO space. My main question I always ask people is, first of all, why, what triggered it, and what do you feel is the difference between the two worlds?
Yeah. Um, I think it's an interesting question in terms of what triggers folks as they're kind of going through their journey. For me, there was a few different things. I mean, I think first and foremost, I was financially comfortable, and I think once you become financially comfortable, the way that you process and think about salary changes a bit. And so I wasn't living paycheck to paycheck, and I was able to think, what else is really there, because I wasn't feeling as fulfilled as I thought I would, or was kind of taught that I would, that money was the primary thing to focus on. So part of it was just trying to figure out what was missing for me, and what does that look like. I also, have an 8-year old. And so at that point started to have a kid and think about, like, what is the world like for this person when you're done? And just thinking about things differently, like having a child changes your focus, and your perspective on what's important. And within that, there's a movie called Chasing Ice, which is was done by a National Geographic photographer who went out and kind of put these cameras in place to show time lapse of the glaciers receding, basically. And at one point within that, he talks about having a conversation with his daughter and imagining, after 20 years down the road, what she would say, what were you doing when climate change was going on? And he really just thought about wanting to be able to say he was doing everything that he could, and I knew I was not. So that was a big part of it for me, was thinking about how could I have the biggest impact possible within that construct, and that's really a lot of what pushed me to make that pivot.
And so what I'm hearing is you had a child and then that started shifting, or was it right after?
Yeah, I mean, I think having the child is part of it, but it's a process, right? Like my undergrad was in economics, where basically the construct is supply and demand, and the market takes care of everything. And I had just had different perspectives on whether that was actually the case or not. And so looking for, how does the world work, and how can you do some good, and how can it just be more than just about kind of dollars and cents. So I think that was already there. And having the kid come into the picture just kind of amplified that a bit more, and probably also, I had been, I don't know if I would say environmentalist, but I was a scuba diver, and so I've been out in nature and kind of seen that kind of things, and seen reefs that are in really great shape and reefs that are not in great shape, and oftentimes the variable there is human intervention in some way, shape, or form. And so I already had kind of those sorts of ideas, I guess I would say, but I hadn't really figured out how to apply them per se. And also in grad school, I took a social entrepreneurship elective, and that's something where there were people who worked at nonprofits in that class, people who were in government positions and that kind of stuff. And so that was also really a trigger for me, and part of the thought process to really think about there being alternatives to the corporate side. At least at that point, that was front and center for me.
Because it sounds to me also when I was looking into it, and I'm assuming most people don't start thinking about let's save the world. So my question then is, when you started, when you were maybe a child or already studying in college, you said you were already doing something, but were you actively actually doing something, or were you like most of us just, no, I just want to go through college, I just want to get a good job? It sounds to me like you were like most of us, kind of going through the motions of actually finding your passions and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I wasn't, an activist growing up. I have activism within my family, like my parents and that kind of stuff. We'd been to marches and stuff as a kid, but that really wasn't what I was doing. And so I wasn't super active at that point. And again, I think starting out, like you said, I was just trying to figure out how to be successful, how to have money, kind of live the American dream, right? Like that's what we're told it's all about. And so a big part of it for me was getting to a point where I was, financially comfortable. And I think, kind of Maslow's hierarchy, that gives you a little bit of space to think about things beyond that once you're there, right? It's really hard to, ask someone to pay a lot more money for something that's environmentally responsible when they can't feed their kids. And so I think that was also a big part of it, just being at a point where financially I was in a good space to have the opportunity and the privilege to think about how do you make a difference.
Right. What I really want to find out in the story is how that journey got you to get you certain skills that are now contributing to Greenpeace. But in order for the listeners to understand that, maybe you can explain kind of briefly what you've actually done within Greenpeace, and maybe the skills that have contributed from your past to make a difference within Greenpeace.
Yeah, I mean, coming into Greenpeace, I would say that my pitch to them was, because of my consulting background, I have experience kind of coming into different organizations and learning a business pretty quickly, and then trying to find ways to improve that via either technology, process, those sorts of things. And so part of my again, my pitch in the interview process was, hey, I've done this many, many times. I've come into different organizations, and so I can come in to this organization and learn what you guys do. And then I was fortunate to be in the data space, which is pretty tightly knit with the fundraising side of the house. And so to come in, when I first came into the data team, I kind of had two parallel tracks. One was understanding where we were from a technology perspective within the data, putting a vision together and creating kind of a roadmap for how do we kind of take that in the right direction. And then the second part was really digging in with the fundraising team and learning how that worked. And because fundraising is about, dollars and cents, it's very similar to a lot of my previous experience in terms of, oftentimes being in the finance side of a house. In my consulting experience, or Fannie Mae, mostly in the finance side of the house, that kind of stuff. So started really with those kind of two tracks within my data role. And we got to the point where we rolled out and got support for a pretty major revamp of all the systems. So replacing all the CRM, business intelligence, all that kind of stuff.
What do you mean you got support, like donors, or what happened?
No, I mean internal with leadership, senior leadership specifically. We have a platform that was the main CRM had not been touched for over 20 years. And when they replaced it the last time, it was pretty bad, and they had multiple months of not being able to process donations and that kind of stuff. So there was a bit of scar tissue, I would say, around that. And so just to get the organization to be willing to go into that again and see that as something that they needed to do, that was kind of the first step that myself and the CIO had to get. Again, support from senior management at that point. And I was fortunate that my executive director, who came in new very shortly after I did in 2013, had done significant CRM work at other organizations, and therefore it just kind of made sense to her. And so we got support for that. And that's been almost 5 years ago. We actually, I've moved on to other roles, but the data team just did the final migration of the core fundraising CRM last month.
Wow,
and so
it
really
took you
excited.
5 years to...
Yeah, Yeah, it was a lot longer than probably we would have wanted to be. I mean, part of that is we did have multiple transitions within data leadership, so some of that my own fault by moving to the COO role and then moving through and really taking our time and doing it right. So I mean, we could spend probably a whole podcast talking about CRM migrations and all the stuff that goes into that and how we did it. But yeah, it was a long haul, but I think we're coming out in a good place on the other side. So that was kind of where it started, was within the data team and within those kind of two tracks. I actually got up to speed pretty quickly on the fundraising, to the point where when the fundraising director left, I think it was about 5 or 6 months in, we had a few people left, but eventually I was tapped in to be the interim for a couple of months to run that department while we hired somebody new in. And so that was my first opportunity to be in the senior management space of the organization.
But what does a fundraising director do then?
So the fundraising director is responsible for all of the fundraising programs. So for Greenpeace US, there's two entities. There's 501c3 and C4, and there's lots of different programs, lots of different ways that we bring donations into the organization. So we like to have a lot of small individual donors, what we call monthly donors, who give us $20-$25 a month, and so about half of our income comes from that. We also have a direct mail program. We have telemarketing, where we're converting people to donors who maybe get leads online, that kind of stuff. Digital fundraising has been something that we've been trying to expand the entire time that I've been there, and we've come a long way on that, but still think we can do more, and especially right now with COVID, are really trying to emphasize and continue to invest in that space. And then we have kind of what we call the special contributor side of the house, which is more the high dollar fundraising. So that's where you have high net worth individuals who may give large amounts. We do a little bit of foundations, and then we actually have folks who put us in their will, and kind of leave part of their estate to the organization that comes in. So all of those pieces sit under the fundraising director, or what we call the chief development officer now, and they have obviously a team that has specialists in each of those areas. But my role at that time was really to work with kind of the directors, the leaders of those teams, and we were in a budgeting cycle. So that was fortunate for me because I had a lot of experience in kind of budgeting and that kind of stuff. And so I was able to kind of step in and be part of that process at that point, which again was very soon after I had gotten there. But I was fortunate that fundraising was, felt normal and was pretty easy for me to get in and understand. So that was first year or so, moved to, director in that data position. And then COO came open a couple years later. And so applied, and actually when we had COO and CFO depart at the same time. And so my kind of background of finance and operations and stuff like that was useful. And so I was able to actually step in and help run the organizational budget process, wrap up kind of 3-year planning cycle as just kind of backfilling, and then stepped into the COO role. Was only in that for officially, I guess, about 6 months before the program director stepped down. And I had said that, worked with my executive director and a few other senior leaders to say, hey, I'll go in for a few months and try to straighten some things out, kind of see what's there and diagnose. And that wound up about 6 months in. We decided that I need to stay a bit longer and kind of unwind some things before we brought somebody else in. So it wound up being about 2.5 years that I stayed in the program director role, and when we just hired into that role in February.
So you were CFO and COO at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, the CFO was pretty informal. We have a really strong controller who has an audit background and, knows the numbers inside and out. So, my role as CFO was really about strategic finance. And so we had a big conversation in terms of contribution and kind of how we pool resources globally. And so I would plug into those kind of conversations, but I was really fortunate to have a really strong, accounting team and finance team that was doing the day-to-day books, that kind of stuff. And so a lot of my work was just kind of stabilizing at the more strategic level, making sure we were talking about the right things, thinking about the budget process in the right way, and kind of plugging into some of those global conversations.
So how were the roles different for you, being a COO and a CFO? And obviously you were both. How did you divide between them? What is the definition for you of both? Because I sometimes run into organizations where the COO focuses on completely different stuff
Yeah.
than in a different organization.
Yeah, it was really interesting actually when I was thinking about the COO job. One of my biggest concerns was it was so nebulous and undefined and felt impossible. And I remember at one point before I had applied, we were all collectively kind of looking at the job description. And someone said, is this too big? Is this job description too big? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. Like no one person can do all of this at one time, but you have to kind of prioritize and pick goals and focus within that. So, I don't think there is a clear answer between the two. I can say for me in that time, my role as CFO again was more of kind of strategic direction. What are the initiatives that we need to look at? Like, do we need to replace systems? We weren't focused on, shortening the close time or stuff like that. That sometimes is a lot of what's going on within the finance space. For us, it was just catching up a little bit on some systems. So like we replaced, some of our accounting systems and better reporting and analytics, getting stuff out of Excel into either data warehouse or, financial systems for the budget. Pushing to move we had a quarterly forecast, but it was basically that controller and the CFO, myself, who were really doing that and moving that to be more of, the budget holders themselves being expected to go through on a quarterly basis and kind of update, which is, sounds crazy, but because it's pretty standard in most corporate spaces. But for us, that wasn't what we were doing. So that was the CFO role at that point. Like I wasn't actively closing the books. Again, my controller is rock solid, and that's what he was really driving. And then the COO was, at that point, it was trying to think about more kind of, I would say enterprise risk, broader strategic initiatives outside of finance, right? So finance was part of that, but for us, finance sits underneath the COO in addition to, HR, the IT data, facilities, all those kind of things. So we also, within that budget cycle, we had some deficits. We wound up making some changes in terms of office spaces, closing an office that we had been in for a long time, downsizing a little bit, that kind of stuff. So it was a pretty strong blend. I mean, I think the main thing that I would say that I did that was traditionally CFO was like, bringing complex financial concepts to the board and trying to help them understand what was going on. And then, like I said, there was that big kind of global conversation about, how we pool funds and that kind of stuff. And so that was definitely a traditional CFO role, I would say, in terms of stepping in that way.
Well, what I love, and the reason also why I was excited to invite you on the podcast is because, and we discussed this prior to you getting on, is that we could focus on, really getting into the business nitty gritty of what is happening. Because I tend to notice that when social entrepreneurs or people that start charities, they really want to get a cause across, but there's no business, or systems are 20 years old and nobody cares, and nobody understands that if you start modernizing, putting innovation in, that things just move faster, things go better. And what I love about your career within Greenpeace is that obviously you were fundraising director, you went into the CFO role, COO role, and obviously the role you're in right now. I always learn from stories. So I guess my question is, you were mentioning already like things you did in your COO role. I definitely want to cover what you did as a fundraising director. But what kind of changes did you do that everybody would understand that is listening to this, that really changed what was happening within Greenpeace?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm a data geek at heart, and so I think in all of those steps, there's been an improvement in terms of analytics, the way that we have insights, the way that we understand what's going on. And that looks pretty different in the different roles, right? So in the data role, the CRM, and we actually put in Looker for kind of self-service analytics, which was pretty significant change from what we were on.
But what does that change give Greenpeace?
Yeah, I mean, I think it levels the playing field a bit so that people are working with similar information, right? So that's one of the things that when you think about, decision making, it's like who has access to what information, how do we all look at the same thing, and how do we make decisions more quickly? Because it's not it's not one person bringing their number and the other person saying, I have no idea what that means, I'm not going to use that in the conversation, but kind of grounding the important conversations and decision making in consistent measurement KPIs, that kind of stuff. So again, pretty standard stuff, especially for folks who work in that reporting and analytics space, about what you're trying to do in terms of turning information into things that can help you make decisions, and do that in a consistent way. And so I think that's one thing that kind of flows through, and looks a little bit different as you go. I think the other thing that this is not one that obviously I did by myself, but I think pushing a little bit on what are the things that we do that are more kind of traditions versus things where we need different things to get the job done now, right? Like, so people say what got you here won't get you there, or we actually had a consulting group come in and work with us when we were talking about hiring, that kind of stuff, and they actually talked about this concept of when you're creating your job descriptions, are you focused on the actual must-haves for that role, or are you thinking about traditions and preferences that you have within the organization, which are different than the requirements that you need to get the job done? And so I think especially early on, when I was kind of the new guy from the outside, a lot of what I was doing was kind of asking why, and pushing folks beyond, well, we've always done it that way, or this is kind of sitting there. So I think that's I've moved around a decent amount in my career, and I think that's one of the benefits that I always talk to new folks about, is like, hey, I want you to ask that question, and I want you to push. Again, I think that works nonprofit and on the corporate side, right? Like to really not accept status quo. I think that's probably the part of the biggest thing that I really tried to do was push people, especially folks in leadership, that leadership is about, what comes next and how do you take the next step, not the status quo, and really trying to challenge folks to come up and have a vision for their space. We also talk about, like, what are you the CEO of? It's like everyone has something that they should really feel like they own and control, and be thinking about strategically how they want to improve that. And so I think that kind of concept of continuous improvement, which kind of, again, come from my consulting days, was something else that was just kind of the mindset that I naturally brought into the space.
But so outside of changing the CRM system, I heard you said something about downsizing an office. Can you tell us more about those things, the bad parts as well as the good parts that you did across your roles, and the learning lessons you drew from those?
Yeah, that's a long one. I mean, I think there's always a combination of good and bad, and my perspective, I think you learn probably more from the mistakes, or at least I try to. Yeah, I mean, I think offices specifically, what I really kind of landed on, we had some folks that were virtual. We had 2 pretty big physical spaces as well. We also have warehouses based on kind of how we deploy stuff out in the field. And from my perspective, we were getting kind of the cons of both the 100% virtual model and the 100% in-person model, and we weren't getting as many of the benefits of either model.
Why did you decide that? What was it about the data that you looked at and you were thinking, okay, this isn't working out here?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the virtual, you theoretically should have lower, costs in terms of just physical space. And so we had, a decent amount of staff that were virtual. And so we were trying to figure out how do you, similar things to what a lot of folks are grappling with now with COVID, like how do you work effectively remotely? How do you build kind of culture and that kind of stuff when people are not in the same space? So we were trying to solve those challenges, but at the same time, we still had significant amount of physical space that wasn't usually full, that was sitting on the books for multiple years at a time, at decent cost. And so I think, that's a good example of where we're kind of mixing and matching. Part of that was, it was a retention strategy, right? Where we are maybe not paying as well as some other places. And many times, we just can't compete in certain jobs if folks are going to go corporate, especially. And so we started to explore, what kind of virtual, how that could be a retention strategy, which I think made sense. But again, it was because we were in the hybrid model, it was really, it was really complicated in terms of, what were we actually getting out of either way. And I wanted there to be like, aha, here's the answer, right? Like we should do this and everybody wins. And what I really kind of landed on is like, there's not a perfect answer. There's going to be pros and cons to whatever you do in terms of that kind of mixture. And we needed to make a choice for us. And go with it. I mean, the other thing, we still have folks virtual, and we had decent mixture still. So we downsized offices, but we didn't close offices.
So you pretty much wrestled with the decision that all of the companies are wrestling now due to Corona. You wrestled with that decision a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of it. Yes, I mean, we had folks that were remote, right? So we had a decent footprint of remote staff, 15 to 20. And, my oversimplistic ideal was, can we go 100% virtual or can we have everybody in the office, right? As the two kind of goalposts of what your strategy to physical space could be, should be. And the short version is we couldn't land 100% one or the other.
But why not? So I'm obviously, as we're a much smaller company, but as we're scaling, these same questions tend to pop up. And then I would love to know what was happening. What were you seeing that you decided it was not possible to put it either in the office or virtually? And then what was the solution? Was it like once a week would they come over?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the short answer is we already had so many people that were distributed in spaces that we were not willing to lose. We were not willing to force to say you either come back to an office or you lose your job. We didn't have it wasn't that strong of a feel on the leadership team that we wanted to lean into that. That's the short version, right? Like we were already in this kind of hybrid mode and therefore we kind of had, let's say, sunk costs that we were not willing to kind of move past. And deal with the impact of that. I mean, another example is like we've often talked about, having a headquarters in a lower cost city. Our two main offices are in Washington, D.C. and in the Bay out in San Francisco, which are two of the most expensive cities in the country. And so we talk about, well, it would be great to be somewhere else that's lower cost. But within that, you have to at some point draw a line and say, okay, everybody has to be at new location by X or else your job goes away type thing. And so I think that's the dynamic that gets hard and where, folks just want to find some kind of middle solution where more people can have positive outcomes than, like I said, kind of one end or the other. So we still have, what we wound up doing is in the US, the ability to work in specific locations or states. Like each one you go to, there's different kind of licensing, insurance, that kind of stuff that you have to deal with. And so we decreased the footprint of where folks could go a little bit, and continue to think about what does it look like to downsize the office space more. So we did downsize a bit the San Francisco office, and that we're having a conversation about when would we actually go back into the offices. And how does that play into a question of what do we want the next 2 to 3 years to look like in terms of office space?
So when you were downsizing, I'm assuming that more people went virtual then, or they would not show up every day at the office.
Yeah, I mean, that was the thing that made it, again, this is oversimplification, but for me it felt like a bit of a no-brainer is the office wasn't full. The San Francisco office specifically, which was the big one that we got out, we moved and downsized. It was people like the concept of the office and they like to be able to come into the office, every once every couple weeks or something to see their peers and that kind of stuff. But in terms of consistently in the office, you didn't have that many people that were there. So we were able to downsize, had to do some hot desking, which folks, really didn't like the concept, but in practice, the office wasn't full. So we were able to decrease and really focus on those folks who were actually coming in consistently, try to understand what they needed, meet their needs, smaller footprint, save a bit of money, and then, explore kind of the hot desking concept. Because again, that's something that wasn't popular. Like people didn't like that. They really want their desk and their space and their pictures and all that stuff. Even if they only come in like once every 2 weeks, they want their space. But, we actually were able to decrease and do a little bit of both, again, because of the utilization just wasn't really as high as it would have needed to be to justify the full footprint we had.
So you mentioned hot desking. Is that the concept that you mentioned?
Yeah, so just basically that some desks are not a permanent for anyone. Like you can go into Google Calendar and say, "Hey, I'm going to come into the office today, and therefore I need a desk," and see what's available,
Oh,
and you
so
can book.
you book tables like you book conference rooms.
That's right. That's right.
And do the
Yeah.
people have storage on site?
Yep, that's exactly right.
Oh, so that's pretty much how you save costs. You make sure that they have a storage, and then they can book a desk because they're coming in that day.
And that was really our solution for, again, kind of those in between folks who were coming in a little bit here or there, but weren't in on a daily basis. We tried to, the folks that we knew were consistently coming in, we tried to give them a consistent space. So it was, we took a hybrid approach within that.
That's really smart. What did you notice happened after that change got implemented? How long did it take for people to get used to it? Did people actually leave because of it?
Yeah, I don't know that we had anybody leave directly because of that. I mean, the other thing that we did is I don't know how familiar you are with the San Francisco area, but there's San Francisco proper, and then there's Oakland, or kind of what they call the Bay. And so we actually split from one big office in San Francisco to two smaller offices to see how that worked. That was not popular. Folks missed, the people who came in consistently missed being in the same space. They felt scattered, that kind of stuff. So we actually, second step after that, we got a consolidated office, still smaller, in Oakland, which we're really happy about now. That folks really are excited. I mean, it's gorgeous, great location, great views, all that kind of stuff. Obviously, not being used right now, but that it was we just said we're going to try it, right? We're going to test it. We're going to see what it looks like to have not only go smaller, but to separate into kind of two little spaces. And we found out that didn't work, and so we adjusted to that and consolidated again, but in a different part of the city and still at a smaller size.
Maybe an interesting question, but when I think about, I actually used to work for charities, and I was also in fundraising. And one of the things I always heard from donors who wanted to donate was, where does the money go to? And
Yeah.
I always remember showing like the diagrams, and then there was always this percentage of obviously overhead. But then the question, I can imagine people that want to donate, they always think like, why does Greenpeace need an office? Why, pretty much, yeah, why?
Yeah.
And especially you coming from a private sector, you're not brainwashed or anything. You're coming in, looking at it and thinking, why do you need an office with a view? Why can't you, to put it bluntly, why can't you like work out of a basement or something like
Yeah.
Apple when they started or something like that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I part of my answer is, I don't think we should think about nonprofits differently than we think about the corporate world as the first starting point, right? So part of the office is, that's where my staff go to work, and if it has no windows, they're not going to be happy. They're not, as you said, they're going to leave. They're going to do that kind of stuff. So, I think the first part is, we're a 40, $50 million organization, and like any other 40, $50 million organization, we need to attract talent. We need people to be excited about what they see when they come in to interview. We need them to feel comfortable and productive in a space. So that's why, having an office that is useful, is good, helps them be productive. Again, the same argument for why you would do it in the corporate side. I mean, one of the interesting kind of narratives is, specifically in the Bay, we need an office so that donors can come in and visit us and see us, right? That's part of the narrative. We also,
And does that actually contribute? Does that really help that you guys are in the Bay Area?
yeah, I mean, there's definitely a strong footprint of NGOs within that space, and there's definitely kind of an ecosystem there, I would say. I think we will always have a footprint of some sort there based on that. Some of that's donors, some of that is allies or other organizations that we're going to work with who have a lot of key staff there, that kind of stuff. So yeah, there's definitely an ecosystem there that means we do need to maintain something there. I mean, I think the other thing that we've done historically is have a place for people to come in and meet, host kind of conversations with allies and that kind of stuff. And so I think that's when we were kind of in between and didn't have the one big office, we found ways to accomplish that in different ways via kind of our allies who had space they would share, or renting out spaces or that kind of stuff. But I think it's a choice, right? It is an intentional choice. Just like you said, from a corporate perspective, you can decide not to have that space. And that's not the decision that we've made. Again, from my perspective, I don't think there's a 100% right answer. I think it's a spectrum, and you figure out what you really are trying to maximize for, and you have to make a choice within that. And for us, at least the last time we had the conversation, it was to maintain some of that physical footprint and not expand the virtualness, kind of actually tighten the virtualness a little bit. I mean, the other thing that always comes up, which is really interesting, is whenever you get people who are distributed together in the room, right, for a meeting or whatever that is, one of the things that always comes up is, this was really incredible to be together. It's crazy how much better it is to be together, right? So
Right.
again, I think you have to make a choice and decide what you're going to do. I think the complicated thing right now is, when I think about if you want to be 100% virtual, then I assume that you're going to travel a lot more to have, 2, 3, 4, whatever it is, times a year when you get everybody in person, and you can't do that right now. And so I think that makes it a little bit different than the normal conversation that you would have.
So you mentioned you guys have two offices, one in San Francisco and one in Washington.
Correct.
So I'm assuming San Francisco because most of the Silicon Valley companies are there, so potential big donors, in Washington because of the politics, or?
Yeah, I mean that's the short version. I think also, again, the kind of the NGO ecosystem that's in San Francisco. So a lot of our allies have their headquarters in San Francisco area as well, and so that plays into it as well. But it's certainly a donor side of it, and I would say even beyond Silicon Valley, just kind of California more broadly, like that's where most of our donors are located in the U.S. And so it's good to be where your donors are, and to be able to, for them to see you, to understand what you're doing, to have the opportunity to kind of interact, all those things.
And what about Washington then?
Yeah, I mean, Washington is certainly, I would say federal, right? So some of it is on the Hill, the very senior political stuff. There's also a lot of times where we're going to other agencies about, ocean sanctuaries or things like that are, all the kind of agencies that are spread around. So it's good to, be there to have that kind of physical connection. There are also times when we want to go, do a mobilization at one of those places. And so having people physically in the office who can go out and set up somewhere with supporters or what that might be, I think that's another part of it as well. But our relationship to kind of federal politics and how we see that in our theory of change about how you drive things has evolved over time. We have really focused on corporate power and that kind of stuff in a lot of our campaignings traditionally. And so it's always a mixture of how much is it thinking about corporate and kind of supply chains and who actually has power in that way to influence that side, and where is there more of a direct interaction, and that mixture has, like I said, that's evolved over the years.
So wait, what you're saying right now is that over time, what's evolved is that politics has gained less power than corporate, or?
I think I'd say it a little bit differently, which is basically especially in the U.S., that the corporations have a lot of control and power over what happens within the political space. And so, Greenpeace as an NGO is never going to be able to compete with the corporations in terms of pure dollars that we can throw at that conversation. And so we have to find a different way to try to influence that conversation.
So you're going to the source, which is pretty much the corporates.
Going into the corporations and kind of trying to understand the power dynamics there and how you can drive change within that way.
And you said that was an evolution, so that means that before politics played a bigger role.
Yeah, I mean, this is, before my time. Certainly the 7 years that I've been here, when I first got here, we really had, I think some of us would say we'd kind of seeded the playing field of the political space. And, we're being in the moment we are right now with the kind of administration that we have makes us, kind of come back and wonder, should we be pushing there in a different way? What is our role within that, and is there a role for us, right? We're politically independent, nonpartisan, and so it's complicated for us to be within that space. But at the same time, it is, it's a unique moment in the U.S. right now, and so I think everyone is trying to figure out what's their role within that context.
That's actually something interesting that I wanted to ask, because we are looking towards the United States as well with our organization to maybe go there. And one of the things that I'm obviously swamped with news and media, and one of the things that keeps popping up for me is, if I go there, does that mean that even if you want to be like independent, you don't think we don't really think that much about politics. You say you're politically, there is no leniency or something like that, but internally, I can imagine people are Republican or Democrats or something. Is that the case, or do people just not care?
Yeah, I think every organization's a little bit different. I think, our staff trends kind of on the progressive side without a doubt. And, something that we often have to reinforce and help people think about is, what Greenpeace does is different than what you do as an individual. And it's important to have that line and to understand that line. And, I think especially in the moment, the heat of everything that's going on, people feel really passionately about what should be happening. And sometimes that's going to show up in our work and sometimes it's not, and that can be really tough for folks, but that is, that's how it works, right? Greenpeace organization is different than you as an individual.
Maybe what's interesting also to ask, just out of genuine curiosity, I remember when Trump was coming up, people were like, even if he gets elected, like, things won't end up that bad. Clearly, climate policies have been enforced that were probably unexpected. So my question is, he got elected. How bad did it get for you guys? Was there any influence? Did something change, or did your campaign towards corporates really help you not feel anything?
Yeah, I think it's a real mixed bag. I mean, the first thing I would say is everyone was devastated. Oh, not everyone. Most of our staff was pretty devastated emotionally, and surprised that that was the outcome. And so just everyone personally needed a moment, if that makes sense, to take a breath and understand what had happened and kind of process that. In terms of the campaigns and the work, it varies by kind of the campaign, right? So one of the things that I always talk about is kind of a portfolio concept in our work. And so that means you have a mixture of things going on. And each one of those has a slightly different theory of change or kind of power dynamic that's been mapped out. And so the strategy is a little bit different. Some of those were completely blown out of the water based on Trump election. And some of those less so because they weren't actually dependent on, that decision making being the key kind of concept of how you would drive change.
Can you give some examples of what got blown out of the water?
Yeah, I mean, our climate policy specifically, where we had just assumed that we were continuing to push on the progressive side and this is how it was going to work, and these were the key things that we wanted to go on very quickly.
Because what do you guys exactly do on that?
Yeah, I mean, that could be a whole different conversation, and there's lots of other people in the organization who should have that conversation with you. But I mean, I think the short answer is, trying to, defend environmental boundaries to limit the warming of the planet below kind of the 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees that, we've decided is survivable. And so within that, there's a lot of different ways. Within our climate work, a lot of it is about fossil fuels. And getting off of fossil fuels and really kind of moving. Yes, renewables are great, and that's a huge part of it. We got to keep pushing there, but we have to also stop pulling fossil fuels out of the ground because there's such a big kind of lock-in when you put in a new pipeline or those sorts of things that you're locking in that investment for 20 to 40 years, and those corporations need to get their money back. Those stakeholders need to get their money back. So a big part of the broad kind of climate arch is about, really talking about what does it look like to get off of fossil fuels. And so there's, a lot of the Green New Deal stuff and that kinds of stuff, those sorts of conversations is aligned with kind of our concepts.
And so you guys go out in the field and talk to politicians what actually happens?
Yeah, I mean, there's some of that. Again, that's a smaller part of it, and we've been going through a pretty fundamental shift globally in terms of the way that we think about the work as well, and really thinking about people power. What does it mean to be within the movement? Continuing to push on those environmental boundaries, but also thinking about like how do you shift mindsets and how do you shift power dynamics, right? So we also say, really go into root causes as opposed to, trying to change the symptoms and that kind of stuff. So, a lot of what we're trying to figure out these days is, how do we think about change in a way that our supporters can be part of that and see agency and actually influencing the outcome with us? And that's a different way of driving change than being kind of a small, smoky room conversation with corporate contact type stuff to try to really influence them or push them in a specific direction. So yeah, again, a lot of what we're trying to do is we went from, if I say broadly, we thought we would be on offense to trying to play defense and prevent rollbacks, which has not been, there have been so many rollbacks, just, 20, 30 years of progress rolled back in 2 or 3 years.
Really? That
Yeah, I
much?
mean, the things that have been rolled back, the EPA and just broadly, all the policies that have really been pushed back has been pretty, really depressing. And so again, we're trying to do what we can to minimize that where possible. I mean, I think we're also trying to build
But what
momentum.
kind of power, yeah, what kind of power do you have? And is it something that, if somebody else gets elected, you can quickly restore it back, or is it really just like gone?
Yeah, it's a really mixed bag, and I think it depends on the policies in question. It depends on how you want things to move, whether you're going for executive orders or whether you're something that's more broad and maybe a bit stickier. We certainly are working with groups to say, if there is an outcome in the election that goes the direction that I personally would want it to go, that there's a conversation about what are the executive orders that should go in the first 100 days or even the first 10 days. You know what I mean? Like that sort of stuff. I think the other thing that I was going to say is part of it is also about it's about building kind of a network of supporters. And right now we are pushing on the within the concept of a Trump presidency, but the system is bigger than Trump, right? So even if Trump is gone, there's still a lot of systemic things, as I was talking about, where we're kind of thinking about how do you change mind shifts and shift power, that will still remain. And so what we're really trying to do is figure out how we can get people, again, feeling like they have some agency. People are really motivated to take action, and a lot of them just feel like they don't know what to do. And so we're trying to create lots of different ways for them to get engaged and plug in our work in a way that hopefully builds a group of passionate supporters who then, regardless of the outcome of the election, are going to keep going and keep pushing. And so I think that's a big part of it. There's a book about kind of how power is shifting and kind of how people are interacting with institutions and how that's different. And within there, they talk about that oftentimes it's kind of the journey becomes more important than the original goal, right? It's like, how are you building that power and what is the group and how does that look over time? And so I think that's a lot of what we're trying to figure out. I mean, I think the tricky part is also within that. If you want to empower people to do things, often they need to have more agency in decision making than organizations traditionally have want, right? Like it used to be, we'd say, okay, you do these 7 things. That's what we want you to do. And that's not really most folks want now. They want to have more agency and self-determination. So there's a balance in there when we're thinking about what are the outcomes that we think are important and what are the roles for our supporters within that. And then how do you have a conversation for them if they say, actually, I don't have any interest in doing that, but what about this thing slightly over here?
So you actually said you covered something that really triggered me. A lot of people don't know what to do. You actually are on senior management creating like structures. So what is the structure that you created for somebody, coming off the street wants to do some change? How do you clearly give them something to do and understand what can change the conversation towards obviously a better climate?
Yeah, it's complicated. I think a big
Like,
thing
do you
for
have
us.
an education platform? Do you have like a website and then it says, do you want to be a volunteer in climate? Do this? Do you want to be a policy change maker? Like,
Yeah.
what do you guys do exactly?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what we've done within that space is moving towards more of a distributed model. And so it used to be very kind of one-way directional, where again, we'd say, hey, go do these 7 things. This is what needs to happen. And a lot of where we've invested over the past, 5 years especially, has been around kind of more crowdsourcing. Not crowdsourcing is not the right word. More collaborative tools, especially with our supporters and volunteers. So doing a lot of, the way that it often would start is you either get an email or you get a text that says, hey, we're going to have a call on, what's going on with climate next week. Please join the webcast. We might have our executive director or a key speaker on. And then, within that, we would have a number of asks for folks. So you have a pretty kind of light, easy ask, and then you want them to have the opportunity to do different things than that if they want to, or if they're not even interested in that easy ask. And then you're trying to support that. So you're really trying to build a network.
Can you give examples of those easy asks?
So I mean, things like there would typically be like, there might be a petition, there might be a call your representative. We actually have a pretty big campaign on single-use plastics, and so oftentimes there it's like, hey, you can go to the supermarket and take pictures of things where you see ridiculous plastics usage, and you're going to put that on Instagram, for instance, right? So there's kind of a big span of things that we would do, and again, you're trying to give some of those easy lifts so that folks can get plugged in, and then you hope that over time they kind of expand. I mean, it's like any kind of funnel where you're going to have a lot of people who do that easier thing, and as you go to the more complicated steps, fewer and fewer folks will do that. A lot of what we're working on right now is really thinking about how our volunteers or our supporters can actually grow that network themselves, right? So instead of me calling you and saying, hey, will you contact your congressman? My ask to you is, will you call 5 of your friends and ask those 5 friends to contact their congressman or congresswoman? And so I think that's an example of where we're starting to think about and push a bit more on, what do paid staff do? What do supporters do, and what does that look like? It's also an area where a lot of our technology movement has happened, where, again, like peer-to-peer texting and those sorts of tools are coming more into play, where folks are actually texting with other people, talking to them about the issues. And, in that instance, obviously they've got a script that they're starting from, but they're texting with, someone else. And so it kind of can take on a life of its own within that context.
I like that, especially instead of engaging one person, you're engaging multiple people. I guess a lot of these things that you're saying, again, I want to go deeper into the fundraising and more of the structure, but I want to understand the context behind it, because the way you're describing it is you kind of enter Greenpeace, and then suddenly within a year you're doing this, and suddenly within 2-3 years you're like COO, and suddenly you're just climbing up that ladder way faster than let's say somebody just jumped off like some school and starting at Greenpeace. So clearly there is a lot of stuff and probably failures that were happening that you pretty much learned from and then started implementing into Greenpeace. So I want to go back before Greenpeace and ask you what were the top kind of failures that were happening, and what were the biggest learning lessons throughout your entire career, from beginning like college to before Greenpeace, that really that stood out? You're definitely never doing that again, and then that you learned a certain lesson from it.
Yeah, that's a good one. I think one for me early on was learning that there's only so much that one person can do, right? And to really kind of scale and have more impact, whether that's in the corporate world or in the NGO world. For me, being a manager and a leader was a way that I felt like I could do a lot more. And so I think that's not, that pivot is not something that makes sense for everyone. But I think at first I really just tried to take on whatever I could myself, as opposed to looking to my peers, the folks around me, and really trying to figure out what is the boundary of what I can actually do, and where do I need more than a person, right?
So what happened exactly that you learned this lesson?
Yeah.
Or was it like multiple moments that came together?
I think it's just, being in a consulting space where it's billable hours and, bonus based on how many hours you work, everybody's starting point tendency coming in is to just do as much as they can do, right? Like I want another half a project. I want another. I'm doing 4, 5, 6, that kind of stuff. And, I think for me personally, it was also just getting to the point where I was working all the time. Like, especially when I first started consulting, I was traveling pretty much 100%. So I was gone every week. And then, flying home on Fridays and oftentimes working on the weekend. And like, that is just not sustainable for anyone. So I think it's kind of a mixture of like, starting to have a feel for that work-life balance and what does that look like, and just knowing that you as an individual can only do so much, right? And so actually the organization I'm talking about, we reached a point much later when I came back where it was like you could have 2 projects and that was kind of max, right? Maybe something little to the side, but really kind of putting some structure around that, because
what
people
happened? What happened? Like, were people actually burning out, ending up in hospitals? Like, what is it? How did you find it out, and how did the company decide, no, this is the max? Like, what was happening?
Yeah, I wasn't in leadership there, so I don't know specifically what was happening. I know people are certainly fried. I know there was a time where I was fried, and a lot of folks would, um, reach a point where a project doesn't go as well, right? And sometimes that's out of your control, and that's just the project itself, and sometimes that's because people actually need a break, right? And so we were definitely, or myself personally, I was in the tendency of, as soon as I started to see the close of that first project, I was coming to the leadership and saying, hey, what's next? And really kind of interested to jump to that next thing very quickly with no downtime between, because downtime was not billable and therefore, doesn't flow through all the bonus and all that kind of stuff. So, I think I also had a moment where when I first met my wife and partner, we actually went to Africa for, I think it was about 6 weeks. And it was the first time since I had really started working that I didn't have internet, and therefore I could not check email for a week and a half. And so it felt like a month-long vacation, right? Like that week and a half felt, because I realized in that moment, by still checking in, just making sure stuff's going, my brain's still there and I'm not actually disconnecting. And so I think that was definitely a moment for me where, that wasn't something that I screwed up, but that was definitely a moment that kind of fed into that concept of you got to take the time to step back, because it just can't be an indefinite churn and drive. I mean, I think it's especially when I think about the folks that you're working with in startups, where it's like, there's always something that needs to be done. There's always, a new idea. There's always another hat you can put on, that kind of stuff. And especially when you feel really passionate about the work and strongly about the work, I think it's hard to draw that line. And I think that's been something that's been hard for me at Greenpeace, honestly, is because I got to the point where with the consulting, I was, I would say I was probably pretty bored, even though there was tons of stuff going on and I had multiple projects and teams and complex stuff that at one point fulfilled me. I wasn't interested. And so I wasn't at my best. And then when I got to Greenpeace, it was just a fundamental shift for me, and it didn't feel like work for a long time. And that can be tricky too, because, then why take a break? It feels good. It doesn't feel like work. Why have a boundary with work? So, I think that's part of it.
So what was your answer to that question? You were asking a question which is actually really necessary to ask. So why should you take a break if it doesn't feel like work?
Yeah, I mean, I think even though it doesn't feel like work, you are just like, there's a battery there. You know what I mean? And if you don't take the time to recharge that battery in some way, shape, or form, eventually you're going to get that exclamation point and you're going to be out of battery. And so, there was a time where for me that was like massage therapy. Now it's yoga and acupuncture, and really finding the space for that. I mean, that's been part of the adjustment for me within COVID is I can't, I'm not going to get my acupuncture right now, whereas that had become something that was really key in terms of my maintenance and that kind of stuff.
So you were doing yoga and acupuncture every day or every week?
No, I mean, as with anyone, it varies up and down. For me, the yoga a couple times a week and the acupuncture is probably once a month. If things are going well, I think that's, ideal for me.
How did you end up with yoga and acupuncture to handle your stress? From all the things, why not, do sports or something? How did you end up with yoga?
Yeah. I love to exercise. I am very inflexible. And from sitting at a desk all day, everything just gets really tight. I get migraines, and actually a lot of that has to do with just how wound up and tight I am. And so the exercise helps with stress relief, but it doesn't release that in the same way for me. I know other folks that the yoga doesn't work for them. I think everybody has to kind of search out their own thing of what is that mix. But yeah, for me, it's just that my body gets so naturally wound tightly, and that has an impact, mentally, eventually. And then the acupuncture, I was having some problems with kind of numbness in fingers and toes, and I tried it to help with that, and it was kind of like a revelation in terms of how I felt for 3 to 4 days after that. And so I was like, wow, I'm going to keep doing this, even though the fingers and toes stuff had kind of gone away. That has become, like I said, basically replaced massage therapy as the thing that I know I need to just kind of release it. Again, I know people who have done it, hate it, don't ever want to do it again, right? Like I think it's different for everybody. I think you got to find what works for you.
I love that you ended up with those. Do you do sports in the meantime as well, or do you go to the gym while doing yoga as well?
I used to do the sports a lot before I had my son, and now it's more of messing around with him on the sports. So he's
What kind
into
of sports are we talking about? Basketball,
he
football?
he's into soccer or football and basketball. He also does swimming. So I'm not a swimmer, but he does swimming. That's actually the first sport that he's been able to get back to post-COVID right now, which has had a really positive impact on him.
Because how old is your son right now?
He's 8.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, basketball, he loves basketball. So that was another thing. We had to get a basketball hoop at the house because we weren't allowing him to go to the playground because of the COVID stuff. And so he's got that. And then soccer's kind of in the backyard. Those are usually his 3. He tried baseball, but his baseball is so tough. There's so little stimulation. Like if you're in right field, he literally at one point was out there goofing off and meditating, and so that was
I can imagine that. Yeah.
So that was not working. He needs that more consistent stimulation.
Maybe off topic, but how is soccer perceived in America right now?
Yeah, it's evolving. I mean, I think especially for me, I'm from the country. We didn't have soccer when I was growing up, and I have a close friend who I lived with for a long time who's Palestinian. And so that's when I got introduced to World Cup, maybe, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. And so I have, over time picked it up a bit more. But then to have my son really get into it and where we are in Northern Virginia, it's pretty consistent and pretty developed. And so all the kids kind of do soccer here. And so I think it's definitely shifting. I mean, I think it's always interesting of, would it ever become as big as some of the other sports? I think that's complicated because of the foothold that, American football has, but also there's a lot of, conversations about concussions and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I was just about to say, it's really becoming a conversation right now.
It is.
At what's happening with these NFL players. And then if you compare that to basketball or soccer, like you're not talking about injuries like that. These people live happy lives, and especially with soccer, you're not hitting anything.
Yeah. I mean, he's not always happy about this, but our son does not have the option to play American football because we are not comfortable with it.
Yeah, I mean, I can totally. I mean, I used to play rugby, and we used to look at American football and think why all that padding was necessary. Right. Because if you have all that padding, I mean, with rugby, you already don't hold back, but, if it hurts, at least you can, dial it back a little bit.
Right.
And I think the statistics also say that rugby is a bit, like, down the line, maybe less of these concussion problems than...
Right.
But it's really interesting. But, okay, that was a little bit off topic. We were talking about your past and the learning lessons that you had. And I think maybe what I'm still missing is I would love to hear, like, a proper story. Obviously, you covered work-life balance and stuff like that.
Yep.
But that still doesn't explain to me why you were going through these ranks so crazy fast. There must have been certain projects that you did that really taught you... I mean, when I go into an organization, and obviously my expertise would be more into the marketing side, and I would look at the systems there and some inefficiencies, and I'd be like, hey, why don't you do this? And these are the steps to get this rolling out within a week. So obviously you were in data, but COO, CFO things has not that much to do. I mean, it
Yeah.
is kind of data interpretation, but the actions that you take to downsize an office and stuff like that has
Yeah.
nothing to do with data.
Yep.
So how did you learn those skills?
Yeah, I think I have, part of it is in the consulting world. I started out in healthcare, and when I pivoted consulting, I was kind of focused on healthcare. And then eventually, once I got good at consulting, I would go in any organization that we had. I've been in insurance. I actually did we had a project at National Basketball Association, all the way to kind of Audi and Volkswagen eventually in terms of kind of supply chain and that kind of stuff. So I think being able to.
So wait, what were you doing with the NBA and Audi and Volkswagen? You went into there, and what did you do?
Yeah, it was around a multi-dimensional database, and so think of it as like a really slick Excel pivot table, right? Whereas you see a pivot table will have this, you could line as a cube is what we would call it, and so it was typically moving something from Excel or another platform into this platform. And so to do that, you had to understand what they were trying to achieve from a business perspective, what was important within that, what were they interested in improving, and then you also had to just kind of migrate it over and replicate stuff. So part of it is just kind of being exposed to lots of different things, and as you said, being able to come in and kind of get up to speed and take a look and ask questions about, well, why are you doing it that way? If you change this thing, I think it'd be a bit more effective or efficient. Or really pushing on some of the assumptions that people have within their model because it's been there for 10 years, 5 years, whatever it is, and changing things within that way. So I think all those things were relevant, as I kind of talked about earlier, just kind of pushing and asking the why question. I think the other thing I would say is the moment in time at Greenpeace, my experience in terms of that more strategic finance, being comfortable with numbers, having a project management background, being able to take something big and kind of complex, turn that into we're going to do these 85 things to do this process. These are the first 5. This is, just kind of standard project management stuff was also something that was not common in a lot of staff for us. And then just the fact that we had some stress in terms of finances, all those things together are really what it was. So I think a lot of it had to do with, honestly, having an opportunity, being in the right place at the right time, being able to come in and understand the organization and then blend that with my background in terms of specifically finance, technology. And then, the MBA obviously gives you a little bit of lots of different things. And so I think I was very comfortable talking broadly at that level, and then also just was very comfortable when we need to bring in other experts to help us do the thing, and depending on my team, right? So when we did the facilities transition, I have a facilities manager who really did the ins and outs of that and made it happen on the ground. My role was up here saying, hey, let's talk about this, what does it look like to do that, and then kind of tracking and understanding where we're at in terms of actually getting it done. So I think it's a few different things, but I think it is, I've had a lot of opportunity to see a lot of different places and business models and that kind of stuff. And so I think that helps just kind of broadly in terms of being able to come in and understand Greenpeace as a complete organization. Like as most organizations, we have a lot of silos. And so we still have folks who don't understand how the fundraising side of the shop works because that's not what they do. They're over here in, the program side, or, they're on the legal team or whatever that may be. And so for me, being kind of broader in experience meant that I was able to kind of step into those different roles and paint a more complete picture of how the organization worked overall. And also, with senior leadership, push on how do we improve things within that context.
So, do you recommend young people to go into consulting? Because it sounds to me, and you're not the first one on our podcast who's mentioned that. I think we published a couple of days ago the global head of strategy for the North Face, and he also started, I think, at Unilever. And the same story kind of pops up. There are so many projects. You learn how an organization works. Do you recommend to young people to do that, or do you recommend that they go straight to an organization that they want to work at already, like Greenpeace?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think it really depends on the person and what they're looking for, right? Like, so for me, I also, the fact that every 6 to 12 months you got a new thing thrown at you to figure out was really good for me, where I need to be interested. And so I have a tendency, if I'm doing the same thing over time, at least prior to the consulting, that I wouldn't be as engaged. I wouldn't want to work on it as much. And so for me, that dynamic was a big part of it. I think also like you're working with people a lot, and so I'm kind of closer to introverted on the spectrum than extrovert, but I'm able to be effective, and I'm pretty good at building relationships and getting to know people. And honestly, a lot of consulting is understanding your stakeholders, your audience, right? What do they need? What are the things that they need to be successful? And then figuring out what it takes for you to give those things to them. So I think if those sorts of things are interesting to people, I think absolutely. I think it certainly gives you an opportunity to, interact with a lot of different organizations, and kind of see different things. I would say at the same time, I was very specific to one technology. And actually, one of the reasons that I took the jump to Greenpeace is because I was excited that I was the overall data and analytics manager, as opposed to just working on that one technology. So I think every consulting job's a little bit different. And I think good for folks to reflect on kind of what they feel at that point. Where are you at in your life? Are you able to put in those really long hours that most consulting jobs have? Because you don't hire consultants as a client because you've got a super easy project that anybody can do. You usually hire consultants because either you don't know, or the timeline's ridiculous, or it's really hard, and you need someone else. You know what I mean? So the expectations for consultants are usually pretty high in terms of why you're bringing those folks in. And so it is, it's again, every job's a little bit different, but I think that's part of it too, right? Like you got to be in the right place to go do that work. When I was traveling 100%, I mean, you can't. Part of the reason why I want to get off the road is because I couldn't actually be in a meaningful relationship in that context, right? Like you're home a day a week, 2 days a week, like that's, you're not actually going to be able to have really strong relationships with folks in that context. But for a number of years, it was okay and it worked. And again, I have a lot of learning and experience within that was positive for me. But I think it'd be a little bit different for folks. I think it is good to dig a little bit deeper, right? Like consulting is kind of shiny, and a bright object, and so I think for some folks that's great, and for others, it may not be the best fit. The other thing I would say is every consulting organization is different too, right? Like you have really big shops, you have a lot smaller shops, subject matter, all that kind of stuff. But it certainly gives you a lot of opportunities to see different organizations if you can find a place that fits for you and you're successful at it.
Do you think that going through a consulting background makes you then a better entrepreneur? Because it sounds to me like you really learn the nitty gritty of every single organization. By the time you kind of finish consulting, you might actually be a really good entrepreneur because you know what to do and what not to do.
I think it's probably a good foundation. I mean, I think again, it would depend on the consulting role and how, how aligned the things that you're really working on or learning would fit with whatever, you're trying to do within your business. But I think it certainly can be. I mean, the one thing that I realized in hindsight that I kind of took for granted in consulting was, in change management, we often talk about kind of the burning platform, like how do you create the initiative for people to move? As a consultant, typically the organization is already there and they really need this thing to happen. And so your job is to go do it successfully. And so it's been interesting for me to reflect in hindsight, trying to drive change in Greenpeace over the last 7 years, where sometimes that need to move has been a part of the things that has been challenging for us to create. Whereas a consultant, typically that's built in because they're paying you, top dollar to come and do that thing that, as I said, is really hard or they don't know how to do. And so that's built in a different way.
It really shapes kind of how you ended up doing what you do at Greenpeace, and I kind of understand now also why you started with that data CRM project before you started doing everything else. What was it within Greenpeace that people started trusting you more, giving you higher positions, or was it just those openings were there and you took them?
Yeah, I think it, as with anything, results, speaks volumes. And so we did kind of land the CRM and have a clear view and a vision on what that looked like. coming in from the corporate world to an NGO is not always an easy thing. And so you had to build relationships and get to know folks. And as you said, get them to trust you. And so I think it was, being authentic and being honest with folks. Um, Always, similar to what I was saying, like understanding what people needed and finding ways where you could help them, right? So even though the big focus was on CRM, there's always kind of little requests that come to the side to say, hey, I know you guys are busy and you're not supposed to do this, but I need this kind of, small thing. And so finding ways to kind of build up some of that political goodwill and political capital within the organization, I think is always part of it. And again, I think it was understanding what the organization needed and seeing that I could fill some of those gaps, but then you got to go do it. You know what I mean? Like you've got to actually be successful in moving those things forward. And then I think just kind of finally the fact that I did have more of a kind of cross organizational or cross functional orientation from the start was definitely something that as an organization we were trying to push more of. And so I think that was a big part of it as well.
What were the main, you kind of covered it, but what were the main reasons, the main differences between corporate and NGO? Because you said I went from corporate to NGO and there was this kind of a adjustment period.
Yeah.
What did you learn? What was different? How did it interact differently?
Yeah, I think honestly, I think there's a lot of similarities when you get down to it. But the number one, especially for me as a data guy, the number one thing that was a little bit different is it wasn't always clear exactly what the goal was, right? In the corporate world, you focus on dollars primarily, right? Like you look and say, does this work? Are we bringing in income based on this thing? And sometimes that's something that we're looking at, in the NGO world, and sometimes it's less. That's not what we're looking at.
So what do you look at then?
Yeah, I mean, it really, again, varies depending on the conversation, the campaign. One of my earliest, I don't know if it was an aha moment, but a little bit of an uh-oh moment. I was meeting with the program team. We had put into place a pilot of a social listening software. And so I was trying to figure out how we could create the story that software had a big impact on winning the campaign, and therefore I could get budget money for it permanently in the next cycle. And so I went to the campaign team and asked them, how can we prove this has been successful? And his answer was, we'll know it's successful when we win the campaign. And I was like, oh, well so that was for me a place where I realized that the way that I thought about things in terms of kind of KPIs, measurement, all that stuff was not going to be quite as straight ahead, right? So typically you could look, and again, you could look at dollars and cents, you could look at ROI, you could look at those kinds of things. And that wasn't always going to be the case in this space. That's everybody laughed, and that's an oversimplification, right? There's obviously steps along the way that you're trying to get, and you have outcomes along that, but it is certainly harder to measure within the program side of our work than what I was used to, again, in the corporate world. And that doesn't mean we haven't figured it out. That doesn't mean we don't make progress. But you measure things like how many people are taking action with you. You measure things in terms of a lot of times we're trying to shift the Overton window in terms of what's the conversation that's actually going on, and we see ourselves as trying to push that window. And so we'll monitor traditional media, social media, that kind of stuff, and try to understand things in that way, which is not dissimilar than what a lot of corporates are doing these days. But I think that was one big difference. Was it wasn't always quite as straight ahead to get at that. I think similarly the construct of my prior fundraising director who just retired had a marketing background, and when he first got there, he said, "What's the product?" Right? Like we're trying to figure out what is because even though it's an NGO, you are trying to get people to engage with something in some way, and so we say supporters instead of customers. But the construct of you're trying to get someone interested, excited about what you're doing, and you're trying to get them to opt in, select whatever that is, that's still there. Most of my peers probably wouldn't articulate it that way, but I think construct wise, we're still trying to as we talked about a little bit earlier, create campaigns and initiatives that people get excited about, see themselves in with some agency and want to be a part of and opt in, right? So again, not quite as clean in terms of, the way that you might think about it from a corporate perspective, but it's still there. And at the end of the day, we have to understand those supporters. We have to understand the different audiences, and what appeals to this group over here is not going to appeal to that group over there. And we have to think about that and take that into account as well. What's really different? I mean,
Like maybe more aha moments that you had. I know we had the global head of the WWF on for marketing, and he had a couple of aha moments
yeah,
because he came also from just selling his startup into this.
right.
So I can imagine you had probably a couple of these aha moments.
Yeah, I think probably the biggest one for me was, you know, just is not enough structure to get the job done, right? Like I come from very much process, big projects, big project plan, big teams. We're going to do this, this, or this. And even, at some of my stops having these big kind of structures that we followed to move code around, for instance, where it would take you 2 hours to write the code and it would take you 3 weeks to get the code into production. And so, being a campaigning organization, there's much more of a desire for responsiveness within guardrails. But I think that was especially when I got to the COO and I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to do, these things, realizing that the appetite there was needed to be adjusted because folks would lean in with you and have those conversations if they understood the reason, the value, the risk, but they only wanted what it took to make sure we were doing it in the right way. We didn't want, process for the sake of process. And I think that's tricky for an organization that's almost 50 years. You got lots of stuff that builds up and we have lots of, policies and process and stuff like that where somebody made a mistake 20 years ago. We put a policy in place because of that, and that, impacts things in different ways. So I think that I think that's probably a good approach generally, but that was something that was a bit different for me in terms of the nonprofit space, and especially trying to be in the COO where, for instance, risk management and that kind of stuff. It's like we're taking some risks intentionally that corporations would never do. And so that's a different kind of conversation, and you have to right size the structure and process to go with it. At the same time, we don't want to make mistakes because we are, you got to take care of the organization, make sure all those kind of safety, legal, all those kind of things are there. And so there is some level of structure and process that you need, and finding that sweet spot is a bit different here than in the other places I've been at before. And then I think the other thing, I don't know if this really counts as an aha moment, but that really anchoring on finding something that you're interested in and that will really change the way that you show up on a daily basis and really drive your effectiveness and your success. So actually, to your question earlier about why, was I able to move up, I think a lot of it was just that. Like I was so excited to come to work, and it just felt like fun. Like I just wanted to do it. And so I think I kind of had that as a construct, which is part of why I took the leap, but to actually experience it and see that, I think that did have a lot to do with the fact that I was able to move up in the way that I did.
I actually interested to kind of move on to one of the questions that I had for you, which is from a more senior level, are you somehow looking over the vision of recruitment? Are you somehow in charge of making the systems of that very efficient? I guess my question is, how do you guys get, these volunteers or supporters and these full-time employees to be as motivated as you were when you first entered the organization?
Yeah, I mean, we have an HR department. We call them people and culture because it's a bit broader than traditional HR. And I've been really fortunate to have a really solid individual there who's now in the COO role since I've stepped up. And so I work hand in hand with this woman who's just fantastic. And, I think it is certainly attracting and retaining talent is something that every organization has to think about, right? And a lot of what we were still depending on was the Greenpeace brand and the fact that folks would just want to come here because it's Greenpeace. And so we had to push a little bit, especially when we started trying to invest, for instance, in our digital team. And, we're trying to drive more of this, what a lot of organizations who are digitally native just naturally do. And so trying to convince people, for instance, who know how to do that really well to come to this old organization that doesn't work that way can be pretty challenging. And so we had to push and really kind of review compensation and try to be a bit more competitive within the market itself than we had been at traditionally, based on, again, just kind of counting on people want to come work at Greenpeace because it's this incredible brand and place to be, and great on the resume, all those kinds of things. So I think that's certainly been a big part of it. To go with that has been a constant push on management, effectiveness of management, and we have really inconsistent management still. We still have more. It varies more than we would like based on who your manager is, what your experience is. And so I think those two things together have been the main kind of push in terms of, talent. The other thing is, really thinking about justice and equity. And what does it look like? What's the mix for us in terms of Greenpeace? What do we want the organization to look like? Especially as you start talking about kind of interacting with supporters and who are you working with. Most of the folks that are impacted by climate change are, low income, people of color, that kind of stuff. And so if you get a lot of people that look like me in the organization, that's a different conversation than if you have people that actually know those communities, are part of those communities, and are there. So I think that's another huge part of our conversation in terms of how we're thinking about staff at the organization and the change that you're trying to make, one hire at a time.
Actually, also wanted to cover, you briefly mentioned it, but the digital teams and stuff like that, and also I'm assuming digital volunteers. How do you guys make sure that they are productive? Do you guys use software? Do you give them a budget to buy, standing desks, or what do you guys do?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a little bit different depending on the project. Certainly for the volunteers, a lot of what we're doing is trying to make sure we have the platforms centrally in terms of technology so that they can work. So we, a little bit embarrassed to say, have just started moving into Slack. And so there's a Slack community with our volunteers where we're interacting there, and have just started rolling that out internally as well right now. So, that's one way where folks are there. So I would say in terms of investment, it's more about hiring the right people on the staff side who know how to do this in a way that's different than the way that we've done it before. Make sure that, they do have budgets to invest and do what they need to do. A lot of that is technology, because the concept for us, and part of our shift, is we used to be more face-to-face, right? Like you'd have someone in Portland, for instance, who would have a group of volunteers they would interact directly with. More and more we're trying to scale, via technology and digitally. So making sure that the webcast and that kind of stuff is tight. Like we actually moved to Zoom about a year ago from another kind of internal video conferencing technology that we had, where Zoom is a lot better. The peer-to-peer texting, which we've talked about, and those kinds of things. So there's also kind of the concept of, again, volunteer to volunteer. So how do you let volunteers know about other events that volunteers are doing? So we've got a few different ways that we've tried to do that over the years. But it's primarily been about having the right staff and ensuring those staff can get the technology that they feel like they need to interact with the supporters in that way.
So I'm hearing Zoom, Slack. Are there any other technologies that could be interesting to explore?
Yeah, we have the peer-to-peer texting platform changed recently, and I don't know the name off the top of my head, but that's another big one. On the CRM side, we move into Salesforce, and we use Every Action for our digital CRM, which plugs in with a lot of different tools because it also connects to the tools that some of the Democratic Party uses. And social monitoring, we use TalkWalker globally. We've had a few different tools domestically that we look there. What's the name of the tool that we use for media? Cision, maybe, as what we use to kind of monitor the traditional media platforms. I mentioned Looker, so we were on Looker. We just moving to Tableau within this kind of migration that we just kind of went with.
Wait, what does Tableau do again?
Tableau is reporting, analytics, business intelligence. So that's kind of the front end of our data warehouse, basically. And Looker is best known for kind of self-service, right? So having a lot more freedom for users to kind of do their own thing, which I absolutely loved it the first time that I saw it, as in a very selfish way. Tableau does a lot of that and is also a bit more solid on the kind of overall reporting and how you interact with that kind of stuff. So those are both great platforms and things that we've been really happy with in terms of the reporting and the front end stuff.
I love it. Okay, so now actually to the question I wanted to ask an hour ago, the fundraising stuff. I think it's also the heart and soul of a charity organization. I think it's important to cover because there are a lot of charities much smaller than Greenpeace that are starting, and I feel like sometimes they really don't understand and can't figure out what you actually should be doing to get in oxygen so that your organization can actually give back. So I would love to know from your perspective, maybe when you started out as fundraising director to your position now and how you view that or how you interact with it, and can you maybe explain what is actually happening? You briefly covered it already. You have digital that you are rolling out. You said there's the letters and everything. How do you track it? How do you ensure that you maximize the profit, obviously the donations that you can give back? Can you kind of give a brief story of the 101 on how to start?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first part I would say is people have to be excited about what you're doing, right? It's always easier to ask for money if people are excited about what you're doing. So it's really, when it works best, I think there's a strong connection between the program side of the house, the work that's actually going out there, and your fundraising teams. And people are thinking intentionally about how those things go together, where you work in asks, how you're using moments of attention, and what is the kind of mixture of, let's say, advocacy asks versus fundraising asks. So I think that's first and foremost, the most that it can be tied to the other things that you're doing already. And that really drives the excitement. That's just going to make it all a lot easier. For us, we really, again, we focus on those smaller individual monthly donors. And the reason for that is we're really looking at, I would say, well, two metrics, kind of ROI, but also break even, right? Like how long does it take for the investment to come back to us that it takes to bring a donor in? And the way that our model works and has been successful is that we've found ways where those monthly donors retain long enough that they are actually worth more over their lifetime than the bigger gift that we might get right now. So for instance, if you give us $100 on the website today and it's a one-time gift, that's great, and we will take that. But if we can get you in at $20 a month and you're excited about what we're doing, you may stay with us for 5, 6, 10, 20 years. And then the value of that is much larger than that $100 and gives us a base of operations that we can count on. We've been doing that for so long. We have lots of models about attrition, how many donors fall off every month, and so we can model based on
Can you share some like basic numbers, like what is an average of how long somebody stays? What is an average of a donation?
Yeah, I mean it's really variable organization to organization. I mean, for us, our average monthly gift for those monthly donors it depends on the channel that they come in through, but anywhere from like $19 to $22. And we usually, it really varies in terms of how long folks stick. But generally, if they make it past the first 3 months, they're probably going to stick around for a couple of years at least.
A couple of years? I thought they would hook off after like 6 months or something.
Yeah, again, it really depends on what's going on in the organization. Are they engaged in what you're doing, right? So that's also the complicated part, right? Like we're like any organization, we're trying to pivot and respond to what's happening in the outside world. And so sometimes they may come in on, a specific forest conversation about something that's going on in the Amazon, and that may not be something that we're working on or talking about next year. And so hard to retain that person on that specific issue. Often what we're also looking for is there kind of overlap between our issues and our conversations, where someone comes in, for instance, on plastics, and then, gets interested in climate as kind of another step. And then you've got two channels or two streams that they're in and kind of working with you. the other thing is that, it's always, we're looking at break even, and so as with any organization, the lower cost to get folks in means that you're going to get that break even sooner. And so that's why, digital for us is, where we're trying to invest and bring as many of those monthly donors through, because that's the lowest cost to acquire on average, as compared to, say, like a telemarketing, where we go and get leads, get your contact information, and then somebody calls you on the phone and we try to convert you that way.
Can I ask what you guys then do on digital? The one campaign that really sticks with me because it went viral was the one from I think it was the founder of Charity Water or something like that. He made this entire documentary of 20 minutes. Do you guys do something similar, like documentaries, Facebook ads, or
Yeah.
or
Yeah,
yeah?
it's a pretty broad spectrum. I mean, so we certainly do Facebook ads. That's how we do a lot of our lead generation, and that, is very experimental and tries to be responsive based on what's going on in the news cycles right now. Also, again, when it works the best is when our campaign content can align with that, or kind of match to that. And so it's not just, here's a Facebook ad, but there's a Facebook ad and then there's a thread that you can introduce folks into. And so a lot of what would be in the email is kind of what we were talking about earlier, like, hey, join the webcast for climate next week. That might be the first thing, or here's a petition for instance, last year Target was one of the organizations that we were pushing around plastics, and so there was like, sign this petition for Target to get plastic out of their stores type stuff. So that's what a lot of that could be, or it could be the patch through to, contact your representative type stuff. That would often be in emails as well.
What does a petition do? I was always interested in that. I've signed a couple of petitions, but what do they actually do? Do they do something?
Yeah, I mean, the concept is, it used to be paper petitions, right? And people would take the boxes of the petitions to the office, and that's still the concept, is that you actually come to the representatives and say, 1 million people want you to, have a stronger oceans treaty, or, not let this pipeline go through. And so that's really the construct within the impact. I mean, I think to the conversation earlier, the question about, do people actually feel like petitions drive change or not? I think that's an evolving conversation, and is different for different folks at different kind of steps in their activism. But that's the short answer. It's usually it's going somewhere to someone to indicate a volume of interest from the public, and a request for a specific outcome.
No, clear. So yeah, you were continuing to describe the different funnels that you guys have to attract customers. Can you maybe also share how it's evolved from when you started to kind of now? Are you guys focusing more on digital? What are you exactly doing? And also, that.
Yeah, I think the biggest shift is, traditionally we've done a lot of face-to-face fundraising. So we have actually canvassers in the street who will, you walk on the sidewalk, they'll come up to you and kind of talk to you about the work that we're doing and try to get you to join. And that, over time, we've had less of that based on kind of overall, the costs and break even and that kind of stuff that we were talking about. And so we've pivoted to more actually going door to door. And some of that is visiting people.
Wait, so you were talking about street is less ROI positive than door to door?
Yeah, because, and this is where it gets tricky, because the retention is much better door to door. So what actually happens on the street sometimes is people will give you their credit card just to get out of the conversation, and then they will cancel pretty quickly in that 2 to 3 month window. Whereas at the door, you can always just close the door, no, you can't come in, etc. So when people actually convert at door to door, they tend to retain better. And so it's not cheaper in terms of acquisition, but the retention is so much better for us, that door to door it has a better break even and better LTV because of that.
Wow, I had no idea. What was it about the data? When did you discover that?
Yeah. I mean, this was something that we were starting to push on when I first got here. We cheat a little bit because we pre-populate some of the door conversations with people who are lapsed. And so they have been a donor at some point in the past and are not right now. And so my prior fundraising director and I always just say this is actually their second commitment to the organization, which tends to be a bit stickier. So there's some of that mixed in, and that's actually what started, is we were trying to come up with basically the volume to make that cost effective for somebody who was going out. And so you've got a mixture of what we would call lapse donors who have been on the file before, and then you've got some, kind of colder doors that are just doors that they're adding into their routes as they go.
Two things there, maybe even three things. One, do you still do that? Two, with the door-to-door, how do you guys recruit for those people who do the door-to-door? Because that's a pretty tough job. So do you guys use agencies? Do you actually recruit your own staff that does that? And then maybe the third thing that I wanted to ask is, how does it happen now with Corona?
Yeah. So the first and the third are the same. Everything's paused right now because of Corona. Just very quickly, we took all the canvassers off the streets because of safety, and just, didn't feel that it was right for them to be out in the streets. And so we are still paused right now. Some organizations are starting to go back out. Some agencies are starting to go back out, and we're not at the place yet where we think that makes sense.
When do you think you will be at that place?
Yeah, I mean, it's an active conversation with our fundraising team right now. I think, we've assumed we'd try something next year. The question right now is, would we go sooner than that, based on the fact that other folks are starting to get out and what kind of results would be there. I mean, I think there's a fundamental kind of dynamic of, does it make sense for you to have your staff going face to face with people within the midst of a virus? And I think that's where we're pretty uncomfortable and think that it doesn't make sense. And so that's been the biggest impact, honestly, for us from the coronavirus, is pausing that channel. And taking those folks off the streets.
Can I know, just out of interest, like in percentage wise, how much are we speaking like that impacts you per month?
Yeah, I mean, the mix is probably 20 to 30% of new volume on an annual basis comes from the face-to-face.
Wow,
so it's
that's
significant for us. So a lot of what we're looking at now is how much of that can we backfill with more investment in digital, more investment in telemarketing. That's the active conversation.
And so, yeah, the question was, do you, before Corona, do the senior staff also do the door-to-door? Genuinely interested. And second, like, how do you recruit those people? Because I remember being in touch with a couple of agencies that do that for charities.
Yep.
And they have a really big turnaround. Like every 3 months somebody quits and somebody else replaces them. So do you guys, delegate that to an agency? Do you guys do it internally?
Yep. Yeah, we've done it internally since I've been here. We did a few pilots with agencies that just didn't work as well, and therefore the ROI, the break even, all that stuff did not work. It's pretty much a constant conversation at every organization that does canvassing what that looks like, but we have found for us it has worked to have that kind of in-house, and that's what we've been successful with. I think it will be an ongoing conversation about whether that continues to make sense or not. Again, that's something we're always talking about. What's that? Because as with any outsourcing situation, thinking about why you're outsourcing versus having it in-house, and kind of weighing all those, the pros and the cons within that, like that should be a constant conversation. And so that is one for us. I think, especially being in the moment where everybody's off the streets, it means that we need to think about it a little bit more intentionally right now. And it is high turnover. I mean, you have a lot of folks who come through there. It's I would say it's probably one of the hardest jobs that we have. Senior staff, we would go out in more of a, not in a consistent way, right? Like sometimes we'll go out at one point really early on, when right after I was fundraising director, when we got the new fundraising director, we did an audit of the canvas. And so I went out to a few of the locations where we have folks and kind of went out with them within that context, but it's not something where we would go consistently as senior staff. There's a specific team of folks that do that. And it is, I mean, honestly, especially after they've been there for a while, if they're successful at it, they can speak to our campaigns almost better than anyone else in the organization, because that's what they have to do. They have to be able to talk to people and help them understand, again, get them excited and get them to want to be part of what we're doing. And so it's a really hard job, lots of turnover, and the folks that are successful at it really understand the campaigns in a way that not everyone does.
So I'm genuinely interested. So how do you recruit that volume to keep the turnaround happening?
Yeah, I mean, we had before COVID, I think we were in 12 or 13 different cities, and every city, it's almost like a little startup, for lack of a better term, where there's people who run that office, and so they decide and test and try different things. At one point, it was almost all through Craigslist ads, if you can believe that.
Really?
That people were just that was how it was happening. I mean, now we use some more of the standard sites and that kind of stuff. There's a lot of word of mouth, as with maybe most recruiting. The best people typically come word of mouth, right? So somebody's doing it, they know what it's about, they say, I think you'd be really good at it, and bring that person in. Those are the people that actually tend to stick the best. So that's also something where we've tried to incentivize that in different ways for those folks.
Any tips for new charities who obviously need to find people to raise funds with together on where to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few different ways to approach it, right? Like, not every organization, goes for the small donor model in the way that we do. Some organizations are very heavy foundations or government money. And so I think first and foremost, talk to somebody who understands that context and can help you come up with kind of a game plan for how you think you want to put it together, right? Because it's basically, it's a portfolio, and you got to think about what you're doing, and what you kind of need, and what's important, right? So to your point, the having the in-house canvas comes with a lot of overhead, and a lot of work for us as an organization, but it allows us this kind of foundational kind of support that we can count on and project, and that's really important for us, where we really value our independence, and that kind of stuff. So there's an intentional choice between what we're doing out in the world and kind of our values as an organization and the way that we want the funding to flow in.
Great. Yeah, so I would love to continue on this, the fundraising parts, and maybe get, again, you were talking about the other parts outside of digital and door to door. Now, what other things were you guys doing and exploring? What is working less, and has evolved into better things?
Yeah, telemarketing has also grown over the time that I've been here. It used to be that we didn't do a lot of calling, and then we tried like a once a year upgrade type thing where you call existing donors and try to get them to give more, which actually the people that do that tend to retain even better than the people that, than kind of your base retention. Again, they're committing to the organization in a different way. That moved to us doing that, I want to say, twice a year. And now we've reached a point where we have folks that are calling pretty much consistently. Like, that's the way that we do a lot of our conversion for our digital ads. So it's a digital ask to get your contact information, and then that flows through to the telemarketing. So that has certainly grown a lot. And again, is something that we're looking at now to say, okay, how do we continue to think about that and push on that? What's the right size for that as we're trying to backfill? As we talked about, kind of the other side of the house, you've got the high dollar donors. We do a little bit of foundations where we can, because of the kind of corporate independence. It's pretty limited in terms of foundations that actually work. It's like a pretty significant process that we have to go through to vet major donors and foundations. And then there's what we would call planned giving, which is kind of legacies and that kind of stuff. And that's one where specifically the legacies, it's really hard to predict. And so you do the work to build the funnel and make sure people know that putting you in their will is an option, for instance. But you really can't model that. And so we're pretty conservative within that concept. So that is definitely something to think about, or like literally think about someone over their lifetime and assume that maybe early on they don't have a lot of money and they're going to be engaged with the organizations in non-financial ways. They reach a point where they're a donor, and then over time, as their wealth grows, you want to have that conversation with them a bit differently. Those programs are certainly, I would say, stable and always something where we're trying to figure out like what's the right mix of investment to grow them. Especially now with COVID, the market has such a big impact on high wealth individuals and what they have available that's discretionary. So that's also an active conversation about what does that look like over time. Right now we're just focused on talking to our donors, making sure the relationships are solid there. People know what we're doing, right? Like, there's another thing where you're trying to understand what are folks interested in and what are they fired up about, so that you make sure that they understand what we're doing, and especially if you know, for instance, that they're really fired up about climate, that they know about our climate work in an intentional way. So those folks in those higher dollar programs get a bit higher touch, right? So we have specific team of officers that have more kind of personal one-to-one relationships there.
Do you advise like other charities maybe starting out to focus on that bracket, like high net worth individuals, or is it better to go for monthly donors in that stage?
Yeah, I think my answer would be it's good to have a mix overall, right? Like again, it really depends on what you're doing and what how you're running the organization, what's important to you, stability, that kind of stuff, right? Like some organizations focus almost exclusively on foundations and government, and that means they can get a really big uh, drop that may set them up for 2 or 3 years, but then they may lose it in 2 or 3 years. And so our approach has been to have, more of a mixed or balanced mix of fundraising with definite, push on that individual donors. I think if you can pull off, especially, having some monthly donors in the mix at low cost acquisition through digital channels, that's a good stable way to go. But again, I think it's a little bit different depending on every organization where they're at, and again, like what is the actual product and who's going to be interested in that.
Yeah, I agree. I wanted to know maybe a little bit more about you and your position right now, being, you know, at the director's role now, which is, I think, the first time within Greenpeace that you are there. Is it so much different? Is it the same? How are you looking at some of the roles that you've had differently now?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that is definitely different is, I have line management for our current fundraising director and our COO, but they have, people under them that are doing everything. So you're kind of a step removed from being hands-on specific things. That's always the case in some way, shape, or form, but that is certainly like my kind of remit is around, what do we have that's cross organizational projects and initiatives, and making sure that those things happen, and then making sure that those two areas are moving forward. My executive director is a former campaigner, and so her expertise is really on the program side, and so what we complement each other in a lot of different ways, but that's kind of how we drew up the line management. She line manages program, I line manage those two departments. And together the five of us make up our senior management team now. So that is a bit different from having a specific department, right? So as COO, you're over the admin department. You still have kind of cross-organizational responsibilities, but you have a specific department. And as the program director, you certainly have a specific department. So the remit it's different in that way. Most of the work is more cross-functional, and that's kind of the point, right? Like you got good people on your teams who can drive the very specific in their department. So what are we talking about as a leadership team? What are the things that are coming up? How are we thinking about kind of broader strategy and that kind of stuff? So I've been plugged into those conversations in different ways, in different roles, just based on kind of where we are and where we've been. But to have that explicitly is definitely a change. But I've been working hand in hand with the executive director for the past 4 years across those roles, and so it's not a dramatic change from what we have been doing before. If anything, it's that we have more and more strong people within the organization, and especially in that senior management team, who can take things and drive them, which is really exciting.
Do you feel like you've become more of a strategy and vision person compared to like front lines person now?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always got to be a bit of a mix. I like the strategy and vision, but if you're not actually going and executing, that stuff doesn't actually matter for much.
But you are so kind of away from the people. So
Absolutely.
how can you?
Yeah, I mean, I am very dependent on other folks most of the time to, really inform my thinking. And a lot of what I'm trying to do is kind of convene cross-functional groups. So we actually have one step below that senior management team, which we call the senior leadership team, which is the directors under each of those departments. And we're trying more and more to push decision-making and strategy within there, because those folks are a bit closer even than my direct reports to what's actually going on. And if we can get that group of, it's about 15, to actually understand what each other are doing and really work together and own the direction of the organization, like that's going to be way more effective than, the five folks at the top being the ones who are really trying to push and drive.
Do you feel like, because from the conversation we just had, I feel like I resonate quite a lot because I feel like it's very strategic and logical and everything. You're more towards the introvert like me, and you've developed yourself into the role that you have right now. Do you feel like you've shifted your very logical approaches to a more visionary, maybe logical formula way that you describe your vision, or do you feel like you've had to change as a person to get to that point?
Yeah, I would say I think I'm trying to get there, if that makes sense. I mean, I think it is. I had a conversation with our chief of staff. It was probably 3 years ago. I don't even remember what it was, but I remember her distinctly saying, "You cannot systems your way out of this." Right? Like that's not how you. And so that is always my default, and so I've had to become very aware of that, and really depend on some of my peers and my colleagues who do not think that way, and make sure that we're finding the right balance and that I am not just defaulting to that because that's what's easiest for me, but that we're figuring out the right way to articulate things. And then also, again, I depend on larger groups and other folks oftentimes for, really working on internal comms, for instance, and how we roll the things out and make sure that it resonates with staff. And, one of my staff often reminds me that my experience in the organization is so different than most staff. And so where I'm like, oh yeah, those three things naturally go together. A lot of people have never even heard about two of those three things. And so I think that is, it's good to have the right folks around you to help remind your perspective versus kind of who is your audience, right? Are you talking to somebody who's been here 3 months, or are you talking to somebody who's been here 10 years and has heard this conversation 6 times? Because those are two really different conversations and ways that you need to articulate things.
It's really interesting. We're kind of going into one of the segments that we have, which is called the crash and burn segment. The crash and burn segment I kind of like because the question is what are your biggest failures that you didn't expect, and what did you learn from it?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think within my consulting, excuse me, within my consulting time, there was certainly projects that did not go well. And I think the I mentioned the MBA earlier. Actually, that one did not end well. I did not feel good about where we landed. Um, I was not as effective at getting that done as I should have been, and I tried to reach out for help, but not in hindsight. I realized not in the way that actually made it clear that I needed help and things were not okay. Right. And so you build up this reputation of being very successful in the organization. They trust you to be able to go do the thing on your own. And when you're kind of like, not, hey, I need this, I need that. And they're like, he's fine. So really growing in terms of understanding how to ask for help, I think is a key one. And I think that's always a hard one, right? Like I want to think I can do anything. And I think even at Greenpeace along the way, I think I've probably stretched myself a bit further than I should have at some times, right? And that's a constant conversation that my ED and I have about like how do we think about my plate and what's the right mixture, and how do we actually get things done within that. And even if it feels like there's not an alternative to me doing something, sometimes it's just like it's not gonna be done well if I add it to everything else that I have, and so we have to come up with a different solution. Whereas, my default response is still often just add it on, to what we're doing, and I'll kind of slug through and get it done. So I think that's a big part of it, and as you move up into more senior positions, usually you don't get less responsibility, you usually get more responsibility. And so, as we were talking about earlier with that kind of COO job description, if you look at most C-level job descriptions, no one is doing all that at once. And so you gotta be ruthless about prioritization, goals, and really being focused on what is important to move the ball right now, and what are the things that only I can do. That's one of the things that we have some coaches that have been working with us in leadership collectively, and that's one of the things that they really push. Only do the things that only you can do, and really using that as a check for yourself. That if that's not what you're doing, then you're probably not spinning your cycles in the right way.
I'm genuinely interested in how you found out when to ask for help. Then how did you? Well, you explained how you learned it, but how do you use it now, and when do you know to ask for help, and what do you do now?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, one of the things that I do, maybe this is unfair, I try to be pretty open with my peers and my supervisors that I will take on too much and that I need you to be a pushback on that at times when it feels like it can't possibly be that I can do everything that I'm trying to do, that we have that conversation. The other thing that I've tried to do is keep, you know, orient around goals, 3, 6, 12 months perhaps, and really try to keep that, you know, in the weekly check-in docs even, keep that in there so that when we're looking at everything that's going on, are they actually, do those things connect? And if not, then there's probably some scope creep, let's say, in terms of what I'm actually working on, and maybe that's because I just need to focus, or maybe that's because we need to offload some things. So I think that's another good way to check in on it. I mean, I have the ambition to do a better job myself of taking a step back every, you know, couple weeks and really doing that in a more intentional way myself. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't.
Great. We're moving on to another segment that we have, which is the considering impact talks. The impact segment, an impact story that we always ask. And the question is always, what is the project you worked on that had the biggest impact?
This is probably a bit of a cop out, but I'll go there anyway. I mean, I think it's people, right? I think it's about the places where it's the teams that I've built, it's the individuals that I've worked with, and the places where, you know, I've had really hard conversations with folks and they've grown from them. The places where, for instance, you know, someone on my team who was kind of interim in a role and we decided they weren't going to get the role even though they've been at the organization for a long time, and to see the growth of that individual after that conversation. You know, when I was in consulting, several kind of junior level, we had a program where we started to bring in some kind of new college graduates and try to bring them up to speed, and I had, you know, 2 that came through with me that are still there and successful today. So I think, you know, kind of back earlier to the connection about how you scale your impact through others. And so I think without a doubt my impact is much larger via the teams, you know, via the data team at Greenpeace, and the way that, you know, kind of worked through with that staff and position them to be able to take this step that they just got through, those kind of things. I think that's got to be the answer, right? In leadership, your job is to scale through others. And so I think that's got to be the right answer.
Yeah, I like that, because when we recruit people, one of the creeds that we have internally is we serve those who serve others, because through others we can scale our impact much more. So the fact that you literally said those words was very funny. But I like that. The last question actually that we have is more of a question not related to business, which is, what are you currently doing or learning that not related to business again, that gives you energy?
Yeah. I mean, I think 2 things. Like, I'm reading a ton. There's a lot of racial conversations going on right now, especially in the U.S. And so really trying to make sure I'm leaning into that. And just
does Greenpeace actually have a role within those conversations?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we're collaborating with other groups and supporting content and actually sharing some stuff, especially around the movement for Black Lives. In the past month or so, there's been a lot of collaboration there. And you know, that's kind of an ongoing conversation, is how does that show up in our work, right? Because fundamentally, when you talk about, you know, environmental impacts, again, back to what I said earlier, like the impacts are greatest on the poorest and communities of color. And so if you're not, you know, addressing broader systemic things, you're not actually going to have what you need in terms of solutions from a climate perspective. So yeah, the issues are interconnected, and I think that is complicated for folks to understand at times, but absolutely we feel like we have a role within that, and make that an intentional part of our work.
But yeah, so what are you doing currently that gives you,
Yeah.
unrelated,
Yeah,
that
so
gives you energy?
so I again, as you said, non-work, I read a lot of sci-fi to kind of take myself away, because I've got to the point where if I'm reading, you know, books relative to work, when I try to go to bed, I won't go to sleep. I'll keep going. So try to do fiction at night. I've been spending a lot of time in the yard. trying to grow some vegetables and stuff like that. And spending time outside. I've been biking a decent amount more. I used to bike into the office, a few times a week during the warm months. Had kind of fallen off of that, and so have taken the opportunity to get on the bike and spending time with my family. Right, like that's at the end of the day, that's why I'm doing it all, anyways. And so making sure that we're taking advantage of the time together, because we often complain about not having the time together. So even though we're all a little bit crazy right now, try to be intentional about how we spend some time together, and that's a good thing.
What kind of books are you reading now? We constantly get that question asked.
Yeah, I just finished. There's a book about New York City, again, science fiction by the name is slipping from me right now. I think it's Jemison is her last name, and it's about kind of in an interesting way, kind of the power of community. So it's very sci-fi, but like the communities, the boroughs in New York actually give some of the power to these folks in this kind of really interesting way. That was a really good read.
What's the title again of that book?
It's called The City We Became.
Okay.
And then what else do I have?
Maybe something you'd advise for somebody listening in great books that influenced you, maybe?
Yeah, this is very much work related, but there's a book called New Power by Hyman and Thames are the authors' names, and it talks about that kind of dynamic of shifting the way that people want to interact with organizations and how power actually works in the world right now, which to me is one of the strongest articulations that I've read about how all this works and the way that we're thinking about changing the world and campaigns and people power, kind of the mindsets and shifting power and that kind of stuff. I think that's a really solid one for anyone who is interested in that side of the conversation.
I love it. I think it's very relevant also to these times, and I think considering we are past the time mark, I just want to thank you. Super grateful that you got on, shared your story. I learned a ton from how a charity works, and I guess I learned also how it should work, because the changes that you implemented, it's very interesting to see. And if I ever deal with a charity, I definitely know what to look out for and things that can go wrong. So really interesting. Very happy you jumped on, and thank you so much.
Yeah, you're certainly welcome. Thanks for inviting me. It was a lot of fun.
Before we close off, is there anything else you want to say to the people? Anything you want to say from Greenpeace from yourself? Share something. You have the red carpet.
Yeah, I think again, data guy, so I'll start by, understand your audience, and that can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts. Realize that you are also, a stakeholder for yourself, and figure out how to take care of yourself, like we were talking about earlier. And find your interest. Maybe it's not interest, maybe there's a different way you describe that, but find something that you really feel passionate about, and I think that'll lead you on the road to success.
If you like this episode, you can check out our most recent one here, and if you haven't already, make sure you click here to subscribe and see the next one. But if you're interested in more tips and tricks, then make sure to join our Facebook group, where you can find thousands of like-minded people and you get direct access and support to any business question from the entire startup funding event team.